Welcome back to this short series on Descartes' meditations on first philosophy. In the last episode, we discussed Descartes' state of radical doubt. Descartes says to himself, "What is it that I could possibly doubt?" He doubts just about everything, including the existence of the external world. He finds that there's at least one thing that he's absolutely certain he cannot doubt, though, and that is that he exists. Not that he has a body per se, but at least that he exists as a thinking thing. This is where Descartes' famous saying, cogito ergo sum, comes from. It means, I think, therefore I am. Descartes then poses to himself the task of finding a way to regain confidence in the existence of the external world. That's what we're going to discuss in this episode. Having regained certainty of his own existence, Descartes then discovers that there's a second thing which he can be certain of outside his own existence. That is, the existence of God. God exists, according to Descartes, because there's no other way than by the will of God that human beings could arrive at, quote, an understanding of a supreme God, eternal, infinite, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, and the creator of all things that exist apart from him. The more Descartes thinks of the qualities which belong to God, quote, the less possible it seems that they could have originated from him alone. Since the will of God must have placed the idea of God within the human mind, God must exist. God is, then, for Descartes, an innate idea. Through an understanding that both he and God exist, Descartes then sees a way forward to the knowledge of other things. However, before he goes on to know other things with certainty, Descartes attempts to address a contradiction between the facts he has so far ascertained. That contradiction arises from the fact that God is perfect, while men are not. Descartes reasons that if God were perfect in every way, all of his creations would be perfect in every way. So it seems that there's a logical error in saying that God, a perfect being, created men, which are imperfect beings. As Descartes puts it, quote, how can anything produced by the supreme creator of all things not be complete and perfect in all respects? To solve this problem, Descartes merely points out that, quote, it is not cause for surprise if I do not understand the reasons for some of God's actions. Descartes suspends his rationality for a moment in order to solve this contradiction. Although Descartes is not sure why God would not have perfect creations, he is sure that God is not a deceiver. Descartes has to explain then why his senses so often seem to deceive him. To solve this problem, Descartes argues that his senses really don't deceive him at all. Rather, he argues that, quote, the scope of his will is wider than that of his intellect. But instead of restricting it within the same limits, he extends it to the matters which he does not understand. It isn't a problem of deception that Descartes faces after all. The problem arises from a difference in scope between what he can know for certain, through what he calls the intellect, and what he can believe to be true, through what he calls the will. This problem is not unsolvable. Descartes believes he can prevent himself from having false belief if he, quote, restrains his will so that it extends to what the intellect clearly and distinctly reveals, and no further. Now armed with the knowledge that clear and distinct ideas conceived by the intellect cannot be deceptions, Descartes sets out to uncover which ideas are of this character. The ideas of quantity, length, breadth, depth, sizes, shapes, positions, and local motions all fall into the category of clear and distinct ideas. Such ideas, although being clear and distinct in the mind, could not have arrived in the mind through sensory perception. To illustrate this point, take Descartes' example of a triangle. Quote, no such figure exists or has ever existed anywhere outside thought. Yet various mathematical properties can be demonstrated of the triangle, whether we want to or not. Triangles, alongside a whole host of other ideas, are, according to Descartes, conceived in the mind without any sensory experience to cause them to be there. To reiterate the point that Descartes is making here, imagine that you had a computer generate two parallel lines that were really parallel, or as parallel as the computer could get them to be. What you'd find is that even with the most perfect parallel lines, at the microscopic level, they're never exactly parallel. They always diverge just a little bit. And if you told the computer to generate lines that are exactly the same length, you'll find that the lines are never exactly the same length. And so if you have a computer generate any sort of shape like this, you'll find that in some way the computer has not generated the shape in exactly the way that you would treat it when you do abstract math. And therefore you could conclude that you've never really seen two exactly parallel lines. You've never seen a perfect triangle. You've never seen a perfect square, and so on and so forth. Even if I drew you a triangle that was kind of badly drawn, and its angles didn't add up to 180 degrees because I left one of the corners open, or let's say I drew two lines next to each other and they were not quite parallel, but I asked you to treat them as such, you would already understand what I was asking you to do. You would conceive of that imperfect triangle or those imperfect lines as perfect triangles or perfect lines. You have an idea of what a perfect triangle, perfect line, perfect square is, but you've never actually seen one. Every one that you've actually seen, every triangle or pair of lines or square you've actually seen, is imperfect in some way. So Descartes is saying, well, since you've never seen a perfect triangle or a perfect square or two perfectly parallel lines, there's no way for the idea of those concepts to have gotten into your head other than if they were placed there. And he says that, well, they were placed there by God. And in fact, God is one of these ideas that must have been placed in your head because, of course, you've actually never seen a God, but yet there it is in your head. In further investigating his clear and distinct idea of God, Descartes arrives at yet another argument for God's existence. In the same way that he cannot conceive of a triangle, but as having three angles equal to two right angles, he cannot conceive of God, but as existing. Quote, "It follows that existence is inseparable from God, and hence he really exists." So for Descartes, the very fact that the mind can have a clear and distinct idea of God necessitates that he exists. Descartes then separates clear and distinct ideas from those which are not. God and triangles, being clear and distinct ideas, are the result of pure understanding, which is, quote, "when the mind turns towards itself and inspects one of the ideas which are within it." Other ideas, which are not clear and distinct, are the result of the imagination, which is when the mind turns towards the body and looks at something in the body which conforms to an idea understood by the mind or perceived by the senses. While pure understanding is of ideas, which are necessarily true, imagined ideas are not necessarily true. However, this does not mean that the imagination is useless, for it is a matter of pure understanding that imagination is a way of thinking. Thus, quote, "since there is no other equally suitable way of explaining imagination that comes to mind, we can make a probable conjecture that the body exists." Here is where Descartes reclaims his belief that the body exists. Can we know if material things exist then? Descartes thinks we can. He argues that material things must exist, for an active existence of material things is the only way that the passive faculty of sensory possession can be capable of, quote, "receiving and reorganizing the ideas of sensible objects." To quote him again, "The active faculty cannot be in the mind, so the only alternative is that it is another substance distinct from the mind, that is, the material world. It follows from this that corporeal things do exist, although, he says, they may not exist in a way that exactly corresponds with the mind's sensory grasp of them." In this way, Descartes leaves space in his epistemological system for us to be wrong about our perceptions of the world, while still maintaining that the world exists. By the time Descartes has finished his meditations, he has drawn himself back out of his radical doubt. Once more, he can justify his belief in his existence, the existence of God, the truth of mathematical proofs, in having a body, and the existence of the material world. That concludes this short series on Descartes' meditations on first philosophy. For more content like this, please consider checking out my YouTube channel.